Racist flight attendant slaps black woman, unaware she's the billionaire that owns the plane. She stepped into the sky, but they tried to lock her to the ground. The private airstrip shimmered beneath the California sun, tucked away behind landscaped hedges, its tarmac lined with jets that whispered wealth louder than any voice could speak. Engines purred like panthers in waiting, and chauffeurs in black suits adjusted cuffs beside open car doors, their drivers watching the sky more than the road. The place didn't look like an airport, it looked like a club, a secret one, where status was stamped not on tickets but on the cut of your suit, the weight of your watch, or the surname you carried like a crest. And yet, into this curated quiet stepped a woman who seemed to belong nowhere, and everywhere, all at once. Her name was Elena Moore. She emerged from the back seat of a matte black electric sedan, alone, no assistant, no entourage. Her posture was elegant, her movement deliberate. She wore a deep emerald green pantsuit, tailored to her like second skin, its fabric catching the light with every step. Her heels, modest but sharp, clicked softly against the concrete. She wasn't overdressed, but she wasn't casual either. She looked complete. Like someone who had nothing left to prove, and no one left to impress. And that, perhaps, was the most unsettling thing about her. Because no one knew where to place her. Elena's hair was pulled back into a sleek bun, functional, not flashy. Her eyes, behind tortoiseshell frames, were calm but focused. Her skin, warm and luminous under the afternoon light, didn't glisten with effort. She didn't carry luggage, just a single leather tote tucked under her arm, worn at the edges from use, not neglect. From a distance, she looked like any other executive stepping into a busy day of deals and air miles. But when she walked toward the steps of the jet, the largest on the tarmac, with a silver body and gold trim, something shifted in the atmosphere. It wasn't what she wore. It wasn't how she moved. It was that she didn't ask to belong. She simply did. Inside the cabin, luxury unfolded like a whisper, mahogany paneling polished to a mirror sheen, cream-colored leather seats arranged in a semicircle, ambient lighting as soft as candlelight. A tray of fresh fruits sat untouched beside a bottle of French water that cost more than some people's groceries. Laughter rose lightly from the first row, a couple in designer leisurewear chuckling at something on a tablet. 2 rows behind, a woman in diamonds scrolled through her phone, glancing up only to adjust her silk scarf. A man with salt and pepper hair leaned back with a sigh of practiced comfort, tapping away on a gold-edged tablet. These were not just passengers. They were presumed insiders, people who knew the rules of invisible clubs, and how to walk through doors never meant for everyone. Elena stepped aboard and paused, not to absorb the space, but to sense the mood. She was met with quick, curious glances. Nothing said. Nothing shouted. But in these rooms, judgment was rarely verbal. It floated, heavy and invisible, in the space between looks. She moved quietly to her seat, 3A, near the window, beside the emergency exit row. Extra legroom. Not first in line, not buried in the back. The seat of someone who understood value, not vanity. She placed her tote beneath the seat with care, sat down, crossed her legs, and exhaled. It had been a long week. Meetings, contract reviews, supply chain disputes. And all of it handled with the same presence she now carried into this cabin, unshaken, unyielding, and unseen, unless you really looked. But they didn't look. Because what they saw, at least at first, was a black woman, well-dressed, alone, composed, and out of place. Not by any rulebook, she had a valid boarding confirmation, same as the others, but out of place by expectation. And in spaces like this, expectation mattered more than evidence. A flight attendant approached. Tall. Blonde. Crisp uniform. Perfect posture. The kind of polish that had been trained, not born. Her name tag read Andrea Kent. And the smile she offered Elena was the kind that passed quickly, never quite reaching her eyes. Good afternoon, she said. The words had the shape of a welcome but none of the warmth. Elena responded with a gentle nod and no extra pleasantries. Andrea's eyes flicked briefly to the seat number. Then to the tote. Then to Elena. She didn't say anything. Yet. But Elena had been in enough rooms like this to know what came next. Andrea turned away, but not before tightening her jaw, just slightly. Elena reached for the small notepad in her bag and began jotting a few notes. Nothing urgent. Just ideas. Quiet rituals helped her stay centered. Words, not reactions. Intention, not impulse. She knew what was coming. She always did. Because no matter how far she'd climbed, how many boardrooms she'd owned, how many jets bore her initials in fine print, there was still one altitude society hadn't allowed her to fly past. The altitude of assumption. She could own the sky, but still be mistaken for the help. She could build the company, and still be told to move. And that day, she was ready. Not for the confrontation, but for the clarity. Because sometimes, what breaks you open, sets others free. It wasn't her seat they questioned, it was her right to be seen. It began with a glance, the kind that lasted a beat too long. Andrea Kent stood near the galley with a metal tray in hand, pretending to count champagne flutes. But her attention wasn't on the glasses. It was fixed on Elena. There was something about the way the woman in 3A sat, not slouched in comfort like those who had nothing to prove, but upright, as if her very presence required her to hold herself accountable for it. She wasn't showy. She wasn't loud. She wasn't nervous. That was what irritated Andrea the most. Calm people were harder to intimidate. The rest of the passengers were now settling in. Conversations hushed. The engines hummed with the gentle promise of imminent flight. And yet Andrea's gaze hadn't left its mark. Elena felt it, the scrutiny. Not imagined, not exaggerated, but practiced. Like a spotlight made of glances. Still, she didn't look up. She finished the last line of her note. When someone sees your existence as disruption, your stillness becomes defiance. She closed the notepad gently, slid it back into her tote, and exhaled. That's when Andrea approached. The smile she wore was precise, almost mechanical. "I'm sorry, miss," she began, her voice lined with a professional sharpness. "I believe you may be in the wrong seat." Elena turned toward her slowly, eyebrows gently raised. 3A, correct? Andrea nodded, too quickly. "Yes, but this section is reserved for executive charter clients." Elena didn't flinch. "I'm aware. That's my seat." Andrea's gaze narrowed slightly, just for a second. "Do you mind showing me your boarding document?" "No," Elena said calmly, reaching into her tote and pulling out the electronic confirmation. Andrea scanned it. Her lips tightened. The screen clearly read, Elena Moore, Charter Executive Priority, Seat 3A. Yet something inside Andrea refused to let go. Because the paper said one thing. But her prejudice whispered another. Andrea returned the device. "I see. Still, this seat is part of our elite platinum group. It's usually assigned to legacy clients or owners." Elena's reply was gentle, almost amused. "I'm aware of who sits here. That's why I chose it." A silence stretched between them, not long, but long enough for a woman 2 rows ahead, swathed in designer silk and clutching a tiny Pomeranian, to glance backward. Her brows arched when she saw Elena. Then she turned to the man beside her and murmured, probably a last-minute upgrade. The man smirked. "Trying to grab a photo op, maybe?" Elena didn't respond. But she heard them. She always did. Andrea straightened. Her voice was lower now, but her tone betrayed her growing tension. We've had incidents before, she said, voice dropping. Passengers trying to sit in open seats they didn't book. Elena's eyes met hers, steady. I imagine you've had all kinds of incidents. Andrea's posture stiffened. Excuse me. Elena tilted her head slightly, her voice calm as ever. I'm not here for assumptions. Just the flight I've paid for. Andrea bristled. She opened her mouth, but another voice interrupted. Maya. The younger attendant stood quietly behind her, holding a folded blanket. Excuse me, Andrea, she said softly. I can double-check the manifest, just to confirm. Andrea turned sharply. It's fine. I have it under control. Maya stepped back, biting her lip. Elena's eyes lingered on Maya for a moment, noting the quiet courage in her offer, and the fear in her retreat. Andrea looked back at Elena. If there's an error in the system, I'll have to ask you to move. There is no error, Elena said, her voice gaining gravity. But you've already made one. Andrea blinked. Excuse me. Elena leaned slightly forward, her tone never shifting from grace. The assumption you made, before you ever asked my name, before you read my document, before you considered checking your list, that was your error. I was doing my job, Andrea snapped, louder now. A few passengers looked up. No, Elena said. You were doing what you've always done. Mistaking your prejudice for policy. A hush rippled through the cabin. No one gasped. No one objected. But the silence carried weight. Andrea stepped back, stammering. I need to speak to the captain. You do that, Elena said, returning to her seat. Andrea moved toward the front of the plane, her steps tight and fast. The woman with the dog leaned forward again. Well, that escalated. Her companion nodded. She should just move. This isn't worth the drama. But across the aisle, the man in linen sat forward. His voice was quiet, but firm. She shouldn't have to move. The comment drew glances. No one replied. Near the galley, Maya stared down at the folded manifest list, hands twitching. She'd heard Andrea mutter things before, sometimes about passengers, sometimes about staff. But this? This wasn't just unprofessional. It was unjust. And injustice, even when dressed in uniform, leaves a stain. Elena turned to her window and looked outside. The tarmac was bright. The sky was endless. She breathed slowly, anchoring herself in the moment, because the storm hadn't hit yet. But the clouds were gathering. And this time, she wasn't going to step aside. Calm wasn't her shield, it was her strategy. Elena sat quietly in seat 3A, her hands folded neatly in her lap. From the outside, she looked utterly still, like a figure carved from the same precision as the jet itself. But inside, the air around her was shifting. She wasn't angry. Anger was immediate, reactive, fire without aim. No, Elena had passed that years ago. What she felt now was sharper, colder, a clarity honed by years of being underestimated, misjudged, interrupted. She had learned, painfully, that in rooms where her presence was questioned, her silence often held more power than her protest. And so she waited. Andrea returned moments later. Her walk had changed, shoulders stiffer, steps harder, as if every inch of her body was straining to hold on to some invisible authority. The captain has been notified, she said flatly. He agrees this situation needs resolving before we taxi. Elena looked up at her, her expression unreadable. Does he? Andrea didn't respond. Instead, she gestured toward the back of the cabin. I'm asking you one final time to move to another seat while we clarify this. Several heads turned. Passengers began to whisper, some subtle, some shameless. She won't move. God, just let them fly already. Elena glanced around the cabin, not with frustration, but with observation. How quickly people grow impatient when it's not them being mistreated. She turned back to Andrea. And I'm telling you, again, I'm not moving. Andrea folded her arms. Then you're leaving me no choice. Elena leaned back slightly in her seat, her voice low and composed. No, Andrea. I'm leaving you a choice. A moment to reconsider before you escalate a mistake you've already made. The words weren't threatening. They were clinical. A diagnosis before the collapse. Andrea scoffed. You think this is a game? Elena's lips parted slightly, just enough for a breath to pass before she spoke. I think this is a test. Not for me. For you. A beat passed. Then another. And in that stillness, something began to fracture in Andrea's posture. She was used to resistance, loud, messy, easily dismissed. She was not used to quiet confrontation, the kind that held a mirror and waited for you to look. She turned to Maya, who had been standing frozen by the manifest folder. Grace, she snapped, calling Maya by the wrong name, a mistake she often repeated but never corrected. Escort this passenger to seat 12D. Now. Maya blinked. Her name's Elena, she said softly. Andrea froze. What did you say? My name is Maya, she clarified, her voice shaking. And her name is Elena Moore. Seat 3A. Executive tier. Andrea stared at her as if she'd just grown another head. Maya didn't look away. Elena turned toward her and gave a nod, not just of thanks, but of alliance. Andrea stepped forward again. You're creating a scene. No, Elena interrupted. I'm in a scene. One you created the moment you decided that my presence in this seat was a problem. Andrea's face flushed red. From the aisle behind them, the man in linen shifted forward again. Frankly, he said, voice calm but firm, from where I'm sitting, she's the only one not creating a scene. A few passengers murmured agreement. Andrea whirled around, clearly shaken. Maya stepped back, almost instinctively, but Elena held up a hand, not to defend, but to interrupt the pattern. She spoke with the gravity of someone who had said it too many times, in too many rooms, to people who never listened until it was too late. I am not your assumption, she said. Andrea stared at her. I am not your profile. I am not your inconvenience. And I am not moving because it makes you more comfortable not to confront your own bias. The cabin fell into silence, deeper this time, heavier. It wasn't awkward. It was awakening. Andrea opened her mouth, then closed it again. For the first time, she had no script to follow. No protocol to hide behind. Just the weight of her own reflection, and everyone watching her confront it. Elena leaned back in her seat once more. Calm. Unshaken. But her silence was no longer passive. It was the center of the storm. The slap was loud, but her silence echoed louder. It was Maya who broke the silence first. Captain said we're cleared to taxi in 2 minutes, she whispered toward Andrea, holding the intercom. He needs everyone seated. Andrea didn't reply. She stared ahead, arms folded tight across her chest, still standing in the aisle like a stone wall, the last resistance in a cabin that had already begun to shift around her. Maya hesitated. Should I? No, Andrea snapped. I'll handle it. She marched back toward Elena. Each step louder than the last. The passengers had gone quiet again, but this time their silence was different. Focused. Leaning in. No one was scrolling phones anymore. No one was sipping champagne. They were watching. Not out of curiosity. Out of awareness. Andrea stood at Elena's row once more, shadow falling over the seat. I'm going to say this one last time, she hissed, voice low but sharp. You either move, or I make sure you're removed. Elena didn't move. Didn't blink. Her voice, when it came, was soft, not defiant, but unshakable. I'm not moving. And you're dangerously close to making a mistake you can't undo. Andrea scoffed, a bitter sound, empty of confidence now. You really think this attitude is going to help you? I'm not here to win your approval, Elena said, calm as glass. I'm here because this is my seat. My right. That's enough. Andrea's hand twitched. Somewhere deep in her body, years of unchecked entitlement, subtle bias, and unchallenged control coiled into a single action. She didn't think. She didn't hesitate. She struck. The slap hit Elena's cheek with a sound that cracked across the cabin like a whip. Sharp. Clear. Brutal. Time stopped. Gasps rose in waves. Someone dropped a glass. Maya dropped the manifest. A woman in the front row audibly said, "Oh my God." Even the engine hum seemed to stutter. Elena's head had tilted with the blow, not violently, but enough. Her cheek flushed red where Andrea's palm had landed. Her body stayed still. She didn't touch her face. She didn't speak. Not at first. She just straightened. Slowly. Like a structure rising from the ruins of a quake, not broken, but reinforced. Her gaze found Andrea's. The same gaze she'd held since the moment she boarded. Only now, everyone saw it for what it was. Power. Not wealth. Not titles. Not intimidation. Poise. Elena spoke, and the words weren't loud, but they landed like steel through silence. You just made the worst mistake of your life. Andrea staggered back a step. Her face, a mask of shock and confusion, seemed to crack. I didn't. You didn't think I'd stay calm, Elena continued, still seated. You didn't think I'd endure it. You certainly didn't think anyone here would care. She turned slowly, her voice now carrying to the entire cabin. But they do. Because now they've seen it. They've heard it. Andrea was trembling. I didn't mean, she began. You didn't mean for it to be public, Elena corrected. A male voice, the businessman in linen, stood up, towering now in the aisle. This is assault, he said firmly. You've crossed every line of conduct imaginable. Another passenger, a woman with glasses and a soft voice, echoed, she should be arrested. Even the socialite, now wide-eyed and visibly uncomfortable, said quietly, that wasn't policy. That was personal. Maya, who had remained frozen by the galley wall, finally moved. She picked up the intercom and with a trembling voice said, Captain, we have a critical situation. Immediate support requested. Andrea looked around, eyes darting wildly, but found no defense. Every face had turned. Every passenger now became a witness. Elena remained in her seat. She didn't rise. She didn't demand. She didn't scream. Because she no longer needed to. Her silence said it all, and the room had begun to listen. She didn't have to announce her power, she just had to be still long enough for it to arrive. The silence that followed the slap hadn't faded, it had deepened. Andrea still stood frozen in the aisle, her hand hanging mid-air, her face a landscape of regret, confusion, and a quickly eroding sense of control. Maya remained near the cockpit intercom, her eyes wide, her voice caught somewhere between protocol and disbelief. Elena? She hadn't moved. Still seated. Still poised. But no longer alone. The air in the cabin had shifted. Not just because of what Andrea had done, but because of how Elena had not responded. She had not retaliated. She had not shouted. She had simply spoken. And the room had responded like a courtroom. Passengers now sat straight, stiff-backed, alert. Some were already recording with phones under the tray tables. Others whispered, shame on their breath, not because they had done anything, but because they hadn't. Then, the cockpit door opened. The captain stepped out, a tall man in his early 50s with silver temples and a face used to control. His eyes swept the cabin quickly, assessing. Maya? He asked. She stepped forward. Sir. We have a physical assault. He looked at Andrea. To Elena. To the rest of the passengers. Then back to Elena. Miss, he said slowly, are you all right? Elena looked up. Her voice was clear. I'm not injured. But this flight is. He blinked. Excuse me. She leaned forward slightly. This crew. This policy. This culture. You may have trained Andrea how to serve champagne. But no one trained her how to show respect. The captain said nothing. Elena continued, this isn't just a passenger conflict. It's a systemic flaw. And I don't intend to let it fly any higher. At that moment, her phone, which had been sitting face down on the armrest, buzzed softly. One message. Then another. Maya caught the screen out of the corner of her eye. The display didn't show a contact photo. Just a name. Board Liaison, HQ. The captain's face twitched. May I ask who you are, miss? Elena Moore. He paused. The name sat in the air like a hidden file just unlocked. Elena Moore, he repeated slowly. As in. Yes, she said simply. As in Moore Aviation Group. Andrea visibly staggered. Passengers whispered again, but this time not out of suspicion. Out of realization. Maya fumbled with the manifest. Her eyes widened. I didn't recognize, she whispered. Elena turned toward Andrea for the first time since the slap. You see, she said, voice even, you thought I was sitting here by accident. That I'd slipped into privilege uninvited. But this is my aircraft. Registered through a fleet I own. Your uniform. Purchased through a vendor I approved. Your paycheck. Signed through a system, my board funds. Andrea's face drained of all color. Her mouth moved, but no words came. I sat quietly, Elena continued. Not because I was unsure. But because I was watching. Her gaze swept across the cabin. I wanted to see who would notice. Who would challenge? Who would default to what they think power should look like? The man in linen nodded slowly, his respect unspoken but now palpable. I've watched this airline from a distance, Elena said. How it evolved. How it grew. And how, despite all that growth, prejudice still boards every flight undetected. The captain stepped closer. Miss Moore, I had no idea. That's the point, she said softly. And that's the problem. Her voice never rose above a calm register. But the room felt her words like thunder. I don't need to fire her, she added, gesturing to Andrea. She's already fired herself. Then she turned to Maya. You saw. You tried. And you dared to call it. Maya stood straighter. From this moment forward, Elena said, you report to someone else. Maya blinked. I don't understand. I do, Elena said. You're being reassigned. Promoted. You'll hear from my office before we land. Andrea finally spoke, but her voice was dry, hoarse. Please. I didn't know who you were. Elena looked at her, not with contempt, but with clarity. You didn't know because you didn't want to know. Because you only look up when you think someone's above you. And that's why you'll never grow. The captain cleared his throat. Miss Moore, would you like us to disembark? We can ground the plane immediately. No, she said. Let's finish the flight. Andrea stepped backward, collapsing into the jump seat, as if gravity had finally caught her. The flight continued. But the journey had already changed. She didn't raise her voice, but everyone heard her judgment. The jet soared quietly above the clouds, its engines a gentle purr against the weight of what had just unfolded inside. Andrea sat hunched in a crew jump seat, no longer postured, no longer proud. Her hands, once animated with command, now fidgeted in her lap. Her eyes darted around the cabin, landing on no one, as if trying to vanish into a place that would not remember her name. But everyone did. Every single passenger. Not just because of what she had done, but because of how Elena had responded. Elena had not humiliated her. She hadn't demanded revenge, hadn't thrown titles around like shields. She had simply told the truth. Out loud. In public. And that was far more terrifying. Near the front of the plane, Maya stood stiffly by the galley. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't smug. But something in her posture had changed, as if, for the first time, she felt like she belonged. The captain remained in the cockpit, but his authority had become quiet, almost secondary. The real leadership had come from the woman in 3A. And the rest of the passengers? They sat suspended in a kind of collective reckoning, the awkward realization that they'd all seen what happened, but hadn't stopped it. That they had waited to know who Elena was before they decided to care. The man in linen finally spoke, his voice steady but somber. May I say something, Miss Moore? Elena turned. Of course. I want to apologize, he said. Not for Andrea, that's her weight to carry, but for sitting here and saying nothing when I knew something was wrong. I've flown dozens of times. I've seen it before. And I've always found ways to explain it away. His voice cracked slightly. But watching you sit through that, without anger, without theatrics, it made me realize how many people rely on silence to protect their comfort. Elena held his gaze, nodded gently. Acknowledgement is the first door. You just opened it. A few other passengers nodded quietly. The woman in the silk scarf, who had once whispered harsh assumptions, now sat with her hands folded tightly, avoiding Elena's eyes, but listening. From the rear of the cabin, the cockpit door clicked open again. This time, the captain stepped out holding a phone. He approached Elena. I just got off a call with corporate, he said softly. They're assembling a response team for when we land. Legal is involved. Press already knows something happened on board. Elena gave a slight nod. Let them know I'll speak when I land, not a minute sooner. Understood. He looked at Andrea, who hadn't moved. Elena, Andrea said suddenly, her voice hoarse. Please. The cabin turned toward her. I'm sorry. I was wrong. I was stressed, I was distracted, her words came fast now, desperate. I didn't mean for it to happen like that. I didn't know who you were. I swear. Elena stood. The quiet that followed her movement was almost reverent. She took a few steps forward until she stood directly across from Andrea. Her voice was soft. Measured. Do you know what the problem is, Andrea? Andrea blinked, then shook her head slowly. You didn't see me, Elena said. Not as a person. Not as a professional. Not as a passenger. You saw a threat to your order. Not because I was rude. Not because I was out of place. But because I didn't fit the story you already wrote in your head. Andrea's eyes welled. Elena continued. And then, when you realized your mistake, you still couldn't own it. You tried to twist the narrative, make it about protocol, policy, attitude. But the truth is, Andrea. She leaned forward slightly. You weren't afraid I didn't belong. You were afraid I did. Andrea's tears slipped down her cheeks now, but Elena didn't flinch. This isn't just about what you did to me. It's about what you represent, and what has to change. She turned slightly, raising her voice just enough to carry across the cabin. We've all seen versions of Andrea. In offices. In boardrooms. In schools. In restaurants. People who believe their discomfort is justification. That their instinct is fact. That their assumptions are neutral. Elena looked back at Andrea. You are not the beginning. But today, you can choose not to be the continuation. Andrea sobbed now, but Elena didn't scold her. She stepped back. Then returned to her seat. And with that single act, turning away without rage, without victory, she gave everyone in the cabin something even heavier than guilt. Reflection. When she spoke, people listened. But when she was silent, they reflected. The rest of the flight continued, but no one on board would remember it as a journey between cities. They would remember it as the flight that changed something inside them. The usual clinking of glasses, small talk about business deals, vacation homes, and industry gossip had all vanished. Even the wealthy socialite, who once turned her nose up at Elena, now sat quietly, hands wrapped around her designer handbag, her fingers nervously picking at the gold clasp. At the back of the cabin, Maya moved with a new energy. Not faster. Not more nervous. Just assured. As if something had clicked into place, not just in her uniform, but in her identity. For the first time since joining the airline, she felt seen. Not for her compliance, but for her conscience. Elena remained in her seat, calmly reading from a well-worn book. The cover was faded. The title is unreadable from afar. But whatever she read, her expression didn't shift, neither triumphant nor burdened. Just, centered. That was what struck the passengers the most. She hadn't sought power. She hadn't used threats or anger, or a threat. She had stayed grounded while everyone around her scrambled to rise above her. And that groundedness had pulled them back down to earth, hard. Near the cockpit, the captain spoke quietly with a voice over the phone, likely corporate. He kept glancing back at Elena's seat, his tone deferential. He knew now that this wasn't just a passenger. This was a mirror that the entire airline would have to look into, and clean. As the plane descended toward its destination, a ripple of energy passed through the cabin, like an unspoken agreement had formed. We cannot unsee what just happened. When the jet touched down, there were no cheers. No clapping. Just a respectful hush. As the door opened and the stairs were lowered, a group of sharply dressed professionals in navy blue waited at the bottom of the tarmac. Not paparazzi. Not press. Elena's executive team. Among them stood two women, one holding a tablet, the other a small clipboard. They boarded quickly and moved directly toward seat 3A. Miss Moore, one of them said with a smile. The board has requested your feedback on this incident before our public response. Do you wish to debrief now or after your media address? Elena rose slowly. All documentation first, she said. We don't respond with emotion. We respond with integrity. The woman nodded. Understood. As Elena gathered her tote and prepared to step off, a soft voice called out from across the aisle. It was the man in linen. Miss Moore. She turned. He rose and extended his hand. Thank you. For what? She asked genuinely. For showing us what leadership looks like. Elena took his hand briefly. It's not always about leading from the front. Sometimes. It's standing still while the world catches up. Another passenger, a young woman who had remained silent the whole flight, stood as well. Can I say something? Elena nodded. I've never seen someone stop a moment like that. Without shouting. Without rage. But still, stop it. She looked down at her hands. You made me think about how often I stay quiet. And I just wanted to say. I won't, next time. Elena offered a small, warm smile. That's how it starts. One by one, other passengers began to nod. Some murmured apologies. Some offered thanks. A few asked to follow her company's updates online, not to network, but to understand. Because something had shifted. This wasn't about first class anymore. This was about first principles. Respect. Dignity. Truth. And Elena, in her silence, had spoken all three. True power isn't shown when you win, it's shown in what you do with it. 2 weeks after the flight that changed everything, Elena Moore sat beneath studio lights in a national television interview. Across from her, renowned journalist Chloe Marston studied her with admiration and restraint, the kind reserved for those who've already said everything they needed to, without raising their voice. The segment was live. Millions were watching. But Elena looked as calm as she had in seat 3A. Chloe leaned forward. Miss Moore, you've chosen not to speak publicly until now. Why? Elena answered without pause. Because we confuse fast response with leadership. But reflection, true, honest reflection, takes time. Especially when your voice might change someone else's life. Chloe nodded slowly. You've received thousands of letters. Social media is calling you the quiet storm. Airline policies are being rewritten. Your airline has just announced a full-scale review of all employee training. What does that mean to you? Elena smiled, but it wasn't a proud smile. It was steady, grounded. It means that silence worked, but only because it was strategic. It wasn't fear. It was a choice. I chose not to react the way the world expects black women to react, loud, emotional, disruptive. I chose to lead in the moment because sometimes people don't need to be told they're wrong. They need to be shown. Chloe sat back, visibly moved. What message would you give to someone watching this, someone who's been discriminated against, but doesn't have your resources, your position? Elena turned toward the camera. And for the first time, her tone changed, not louder, but deeper. To the girl sitting in a classroom being overlooked. The young man followed through on a store he helped pay rent for. To the elder woman waiting longer in the hospital line. You don't need power to demand respect. You don't need wealth to claim dignity. You don't even need a voice as long as someone else's. What you need is resolve. What you need is to not shrink. She paused. Because the world already tries to make you small. You don't have to help it. The studio went quiet. Online, comment threads exploded. People posted stories, tagged relatives, uploaded photos of themselves holding handwritten signs, I will not shrink. The next day, Elena posted a message on her company's page. Luxury is not about appearance. It's about experience. And the foundation of every worthy experience, in the air or on the ground, is respect. She announced sweeping reforms. Every crew member, regardless of seniority, would undergo empathy first, equity-led training. Every complaint would be reviewed by a third-party board, not just management. Anonymous reporting would be guaranteed for all staff, especially juniors. Maya, the flight attendant who had quietly stood by Elena that day, was named Director of Service Ethics, the youngest to hold a leadership role in the company's 24-year history. In a private ceremony, Maya stood beside Elena on a rooftop terrace above their headquarters. I'm not ready, Maya whispered as applause broke behind her. You weren't ready when you spoke up either, Elena replied. And yet, you did. Tears formed in Maya's eyes. You saw me, she said. Elena shook her head gently. No. You made it impossible not to. Meanwhile, Andrea's name trended for 3 days, not in celebration, but in consequence. She issued a public apology, but the damage was done. She wasn't cancelled. Elena didn't believe in cancellation. She believed in consequences with paths to growth. In a post months later, Andrea shared she had entered counseling and begun working with a nonprofit that supports unconscious bias training. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She chose accountability. Elena, in turn, did not state her. Because true power doesn't announce what it forgives. It just moves forward. Months later. At a business leadership summit in New York, Elena stood before a crowd of 4,000. She wore a navy suit. No jewelry. No notes. She looked out over the crowd and simply said, "I was once told, people like you don't belong in this room. But rooms have doors. And doors can open." She smiled. "And when they don't, I build new ones." Applause thundered. 1 year later. On a quiet flight from San Diego to Seattle, a new crew welcomed a new set of passengers. Among them, a young black woman in a gray cardigan, holding a copy of How to Lead When You're Ignored by Elena Moore. She sat in 3A. The attendant offered her a drink and a warm smile. "Welcome aboard, Ms. Jennings. Let us know if there's anything you need." No questions asked. No assumptions made. Just service. Just respect. As the jet lifted into the sky, the woman opened the book and began to read, and somewhere far above the clouds, Elena Moore smiled, knowing that some victories don't end in applause. They begin in the silence that follows. If this story moved you, like, share. Comment below. Have you ever faced a moment where you had to stay calm while standing your ground? Subscribe for more real, powerful stories that remind us. Respect is not a favor. It's right. Thank you for flying with stories that matter, and until next time, stand tall. Speak true. And never shrink to fit.